In this chapter, we're going to talk about one of the more complex structures in chess called the Hedgehog structure. It's a funny name. It's basically named after the black pawn structure of having pawns like this, which is basically covering all kind of squares, meaning that it's a sort of, I wouldn't say defensive structure, but at sort of the first instant it is. It's very difficult for white to get forward like that. White cannot approach, and that's why it's called hedgehog, because like a hedgehog, it will sort of defend its space. It's gonna, if you're gonna get close to a hedgehog, you will get hurt, and the same is the idea here. It's a very complicated structure. I mean, the author sort of explains it that, well, what are the black plans? Well, sometimes you would like to play d5, and sometimes you would like to play b5, or sometimes you would like to play g5, or sometimes you would like to combine it, and at times you don't, well, want to do any of this, but just sit and wait. How about from the white's perspective? Well, maybe you want to play c5, maybe you want to play b4, or you could also play a4, or you can combine these things. But of course, you could also play even, let's say, f4, f5, or even sometimes g4 and attack on the king's side. And again, these things can be combined. It's a very, very complicated and fluid position to sort of describe, or structure to describe just in general. Of course, there is, I mean, you know, we will probably put a bishop on b7. It feels like a natural square, but it's also, there is, let's say, generic positions where all the pieces are on the board. Then we will have a bishop on b7, knights on d7 and f6, and a bishop on e7, and let's say rooks on e8 and c8, and we have castled the king, and the queen goes to b8. This is what you can say a classical hedgehog structure. But there is so many nuances. For instance, also, well, what happens if all the pieces are exchanged? So there is only a few pieces left. Then the logic could be that the more exchanges, the more it favors the one who has less space. But that's not at all the case, as we will see, or not always the case. I think it's such a complicated structure that we should get on with the actual examples, because it's too difficult just to generalize. Too many plans, too many nuances. But I think an anecdote, or not an anecdote, but a piece of wisdom by Mihai Suba, the sort of slash British Romanian grandmaster, wrote in an interesting book at some point. He said that, well, in this kind of hedgehog structures, there can be situations where white has all his pieces in in ideal circumstances, and black do not. And because of that, black is better. It makes no sense. But his point is that if white has all his pieces in optimal squares, but cannot do something aggressive, direct, and positive with it, and black can still keep improving his position, it could actually be black who is better. That sounds kind of weird, and I guess I also explained it badly, but it's the debate of the solidity of the black position, and that sort of black will quietly regroup. He will make sure that he's still too solid for white to break through, and then he will have long-term perspectives, with breaks as b5 and d5 eventually happening. Yeah, I'm sorry for not explaining the Suba piece of wisdom perhaps better, but it's something that made a long-lasting sort of effect on me. This idea that, well, your position can look nice. It can look like you have extra space. But if you can't do something about it, well, then perhaps you have just exposed yourself. So I think, well, you will see when we sort of dig into this chapter that we will get an idea of what can white do with this space, and what can black sort of, how can black counter it? And if white gets stuck, how can black then sort of counterattack? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's jump to the real examples and finish the introduction here. We are starting off this chapter at the absolute highest level. This is a Kasparov versus Kramnik match game from 2001. And before you start thinking that I'm misremembering the years, yes, the big Kasparov-Kramnik match was in 2000, when Kramnik took over the World Championship for Kasparov in a very surprising win in London. The 2001 match is a much smaller thing, but they did actually play 4 games against each other as a Botvinnik memorial in 2001. well, I can witness that I was there, or I was almost there, because at the same time, also in Moscow, the FIDE World Championship was happening. And at that time, there was this kind of a split between, well, the FIDE World Championship and Kasparov and Kramnik's title. So perhaps they were trying to spoil the party a little bit, or steal the attention, rather. So they were having a match at that time. Well, I think more or less on the same day, I lost a game to Vichy Anand, which, while losing is always painful, it meant that we got in touch and I became a chess second, and has basically been my job ever since. So there is quite some mixed feelings about this game. Anyway, let's talk about chess and not about my sort of youthful memories, right? The author is having this position as a idealized version of what White really would like to achieve in the Hedgehog. It's actually a position from a game, so you could say that it's a game example. You can also say it's basically some kind of generic positions where White has managed to put his pieces in a completely ideal way. It's a typical Hedgehog in the terms of that, well, we can see there's only an exchange of pawns, the C from the D pawn, so we get some kind of Sicilian structure. And then all the minor pieces are still, not only just the only minor pieces, but all the pieces are actually still on the board. I think the author makes some very good key observations. He says that, well, this is ideal from White's perspective, or you should really try and understand why. His first point is that Rooks belongs in the C and B file. So it's important to understand, well, the D file is open, but there is no action going on there. I mean, well, that is actually not the place it should be. On the other hand, the B and the C file is where we really want action to happening. I mean, we want to start opening these files to attack and break down sort of Black's cozy defense. And well, for instance, we are targeting the queen in the B file like this. So this puts considerable pressure. But that, I think, is a key thing to understand, that it's not about the D file, it's the B and the C file that matters. His second point is that this queen on C1 is actually quite well placed. It, for a start, protects the rook on B1, and I would argue on my own that it's also sort of enhances this rook, but that it connects these things and means that B1 is protected is useful when we start targeting the queen. But also, well, while the D file to some extent is a White's open file, it's Black who actually would like to push D5, and then having the queen out of the way on C1 is quite great. His third point is that the bishop on G1 is very well placed. We can see that Black has made this construction, which is very typical, and it's aimed at attacking the H2 pawn. But when we have a bishop on G1, this one is cozily defended. Of course, you could make the argument that isn't this a passive construction? I would say no, it's a very solid construction. It's a construction that Black really can't get to. Well, he actually can. The only way he can do it is to sort of launch forward this pawn. And this is a theme we will see in upcoming examples. But this construction in the corner is extremely solid, and it's aimed at sort of neutralizing this attack with D5 suddenly opening the position and attacking like this. So this corner construction is also a key part of it. And then he mentions as the final point that these knights are sort of ideally placed in the sense that, well, they are centrally placed, but also, I don't know, to call it out of the way is a bit weird because they are centrally placed. But for instance, I mean, a Black break with the D5, you can always take like play C5, and then, well, these knights are not gonna get harmed. So you cannot really start, I mean, you cannot attack them. They are actually very usefully placed, and they are, I would say, they are looking mainly in the queenside direction. So they are helping to sort of push these pawns. And that's what he says that, well, what is it that means, well, what is White gonna do next? And White is basically pushing either A5, B5 or C5, depending on circumstances. And for that, I would argue these knights are excellently placed because they are defended. So when the D file opens, there's nothing that hangs on the of these knights. So all that, I would say, sure. I mean, people of my age group who grew up studying the game like, well, more than 20 years ago, we know this example from Kasparov. We know that this is kind of how you would like to put the pieces. There was nothing shocking for me there. The shocking point was when I thought, okay, let me turn on the engine and see what it says. Well, take your own guess. What do you think here? Is white slightly better? No, white is completely winning, which is quite shocking for me. The computer gives +2 in this position. +2 is not a small edge, it's a completely winning edge. So that is pretty shocking to me that, well, this is a winning position for white. This is very unusual, right? I mean, I wanted, or the author wants to show a generic situation that, sure, white has put his pieces nicely, but normally things are not too bad for the opposing side. Here it is. It's just a tragedy. There's basically nothing you can do against mainly the move a5. If white was to move, he would play the move a5, and black would basically be, I mean, well, yeah, okay, I will make a random move h5. It's not random, but after a5, something like this, and well, one thing is the move b5. We will see this example in later sort of similar positions. But even something like takes, and the queen has to go to c8 because of the threat, and then c5 is just crushing. Something like this, while we have created complete symmetry, well, we see the power of these constructions. I mean that, well, now a6 is hanging with the knight here, but also basically these pieces are, well, they're just going to die basically due to the pressure in the C file. So white's threats are actually extremely immediate in this position, and it's still hard for me to grasp that this is just a winning position for white. I have really put on the engine like 5 times to make sure I'm not doing anything wrong in the setup, but I'm not. It's just a winning position. The game was actually a draw. Kramnik was even close to winning it, but of course he was in huge trouble before that happened. And I think also that's why the author has chosen not to have any further moves in the book. He's just saying, well, this position is a key thing to sort of understanding what white should do. I started thinking, what is it that's wrong with the black position? And perhaps you can make the argument that this construction is not ideal. It's something that we are basically told that that's how you put your pieces. You create counterplay against h2. And I think we will debate it in the further examples. And sometimes it will work rather well for black. Quite often it will not. But I think this is part of why this position is pretty bad. So I tried setting up a position like this just to grasp, is the white concept also efficient here? I mean, this is basically a very, very straightforward standard position, right? But black now has a bishop on f8 instead and the queen on c7. So he's much less vulnerable to this battery. At least that was my thought. But the computer still says that in this specific position, you can play a5, and if you take it, then c5 is much better for white. You're starting to have threats like c6, so of course there is some kind of tactics involved. But even so, I guess we get to see the power of this white construction. So I thought that a very interesting way to start this chapter, that he shows not a game, but a position, but the ideal for white. And for me, the really breathtaking thing is that this position is +2. I still feel like there is something wrong when I say it. I can't really believe it because, well, it looks like a normal hedgehog position where both players has done more or less what you would expect. And, well, this is not two weak players. It's Kasparov and Kramnik. It's major intellectual players in this game ever, and especially at the time the game was played. So, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm still a little bit shocked but I think it is shock that really forms our intuition. And it's just very interesting. So I really look forward to the next examples to sort of discuss this topic even further. Our next game is Prussia's against Isaac, and well, it's also a very standard situation, I would say. I think here, I mean, both players has put their pieces in incredibly typical positions, right? And unlike the previous example, the bishop is now on e7, which I think is quite a major difference that we spoke a little bit about in the previous example as well. And we can see that, I would argue, perhaps White's rook and this knight is not placed on what we are now taught is the most optimal squares. So how should White proceed here? In the game he goes rook f to d1, which is of course extremely logical and standard. And you can also argue that time perhaps not is of sort of utmost matter. So you can make some reasonable moves and then only regroup a little bit later. I was trying to think of how could we reach sort of the optimum position. I mean, playing a move like rook c2 is quite logical, right? Why are we not trying to get the rook to b1 immediately? And then, well, we have the rooks where we really want them. Here perhaps the problem is that Black has this typical plan of playing the move h5, and it's not like it's massively sort of good and that Black is better, but it's a reasonable way of creating counterplay. And here it seems like circumstances for doing it is rather good. Let's say you go rook b1, we're going to put the pawn on h4. And while you can make the case for this being a weakness, when there is a bishop on e7, it is kind of protected quite well. What is the pawn doing on h4? Well, I guess we would like to put it to h3 and then potentially open sort of this battery, well, actually just a bishop against the white king. There is some, I mean, it's creating a considerable amount of unpleasantness here. And should White play the move h3, then of course the g3 square becomes available and we will start shifting our knight in that direction. So if rook c2, then probably h5 is the right move. So how could we do things differently? Well, another idea would be to put the bishop on g1. I understand that in the last example, I was explaining that, well, Kasparov put the bishop on g1 to protect the h2 pawn. But you can make a case for that. It's actually just pretty well placed here in general terms. On e3, it's a little bit more exposed. It could be hanging, well, from the rook when sort of the center blows open with d5 and the e file starts opening. On g1, it's quite an efficient piece that is sort of out of the way, but still has influence in this diagonal. Of course, on e3 it also has this other diagonal, but it's a bit more exposed. Now the computer says that if you go h5, we actually can play the move h3. As advertised, it weakens the g3 square, but after h4, bishop to h2, White has it quite under control. And the point is that should you go knight h5, there isn't you are sort of not having enough pressure on this pawn, which means we can play the move f4 here. And this position turns out to be quite promising for White. So a move like bishop g1 would perhaps be a quite reasonable start, but it's not like it changes a lot. But I think, well, this is quite typical of this kind of hedgehog positions that, well, both players are trying to do their sort of standard plans, but they have to look out for when circumstances favorable for moves like h5 and so on and so forth. Well, of course, they have to control the d5 break all the time. So it's actually, I mean, a pretty standard position, but with a lot of tension. I mean, you have to watch out for, well, not allowing the very sort of favorable advances for your opponent. Prussia's plays rook f to d1. Here you could consider playing h5 as well. And I'm very stunned that the computer says the best move here is h4. Generally, well, we don't like making moves like this in front of our king, right? But, well, so did black. Of course, I would make an argument for this king being a little bit more lonely than the black one, although if we sort of look at pieces in the vicinity, there's actually just as many as whites as of black. So I don't know why, but that's just how I intuitively feel. But I guess the argument is that, well, white has more space. So playing a move like h4 perhaps is not too bad. Maybe my problem is also that in my youth, I lost a game to Rasuvaev with the white pieces, where I put too many pawns on the fourth rank, and he told me, well, you know, I was told that when you put 5 pawns on the fourth rank against the Hedgehog, you will lose, and you, young guy, you put 6. So maybe I'm just afraid of putting a pawn like this. That could be that I'm simply too scarred. But here it looks still somewhat out of place, but the computer says it's a reasonable idea. The game went knight e5, also extremely typical, having an immediate threat on the c4 pawn. So white goes knight a4, counter-attacking like this. Now black goes bishop a8. It would have been more exact to play the move knight f to d7 now. Now, well, you see there has been this exchange of guards that, well, the knight has basically moved from f6 to e5 due to sort of a reshuffle like this. The problem with bishop a8 is there's now a typical tactic exists. White could take on b6, so obviously black takes back, and now knight f5. And in a line like this, despite that white at the moment only has 2 pawns for the piece, there is a chance he will pick up a third one. It's a pair of bishops and two sort of connected passed pawns. The computer actually assesses this as quite favorable for white. It's a bit surprising to me when you just look at the position, but well, the computers normally know what they are doing, and it seems like it's black who has to fight for a draw, perhaps trying to, well, give up a piece for 2 pawns and sort of equalize like that. But computer says that this position is just quite pleasant for white, actually. But black could just avoid it by playing the move knight f to d7, so I thought it was just reasonable to flick in this theme. So game was bishop a8, bishop f1, knight f to d7. So, and now he sets up this kind of, well, rook to c file and b file like we saw in the previous example. Here, after rook c2, black plays the move to bishop d8, and that's also how you are basically told that's how black should do it in the Hedgehog. But here, computer really doesn't like it. The question is, what else should black do? I'm somewhat surprised that the computer says the move h6. It's basically just, I don't know, making a move, preventing back rank mate, you could argue. And let's say after bishop g1, it says knight g6, rook b1, it shuffles a bit like this, and basically think you have a quite solid position. If you remember the previous diagram, it says like something like more than +2, right? Here it says white is slightly better, but nothing particular to worry about. I mean, this is sort of the generic position I talked about, that white is typically a bit better, but nothing is particularly wrong. I mean, here it seems like black is much better set up for preventing these kind of pushes. Well, you can argue that black he's just actually staying passive, avoiding to lose immediately, what was the case in the previous example. It has to be mentioned that the computer is not fully going for passivity. It also mentions that a move like g5 is not completely hopeless here. You want to play g4 at some point. Well, I guess you want to go king h8, perhaps rook g8 first. Well, this is a common plan also. Fischer was famous for winning a game with reverse colors in this structure against Ulf Andersen, and quite recently we have seen Magnus Carlsen also win something like this against Abdus Torov. So this is a typical plan, but again, not sort of fully approved by the computer, but to a certain extent. And here it's a decent version. I think the computer line goes against something like this, and well, it is not too bad for black. Of course, it's not gonna be made immediately, but if white puts too much attention to the queen side, it's good that we have some kind of counterplay. And well, the g5 pawn also sort of prevents this push, which means that this construction is quite stable. And this construction both keeps an eye on this, let's say, b5 and c5 breaks on the queen side. They're not in the way, and they're also looking somewhat towards the king side. Anyway, white is still slightly better, no doubt. But black goes for this bishop d8 regrouping. That was generally supposed to be quite pleasant, but well, I'm less impressed based on these examples and modern engines. So white retreats bishop g1, a bishop to c7, and now rook to b1. And basically, well, things has improved for white, and they have sort of deteriorated for black. And a lot of it is this construction means that when sort of the b file opens, this queen is going to be in trouble. It's true that we are not fully ready for c5 yet, because, I mean, black can take it, and when we take back, this will be hanging, but we're going to do the Kasparov move, queen c1, to sort of prepare it. Basically, there is not much you can do with black here. I mean, the author suggests a couple of ideas. He says that, well, d5 just doesn't work, because here, sure, you're opening the center, but, well, you're winning a pawn like this, and the rook is hanging. That doesn't really work. I think his main point is that if something like rook c to d8, you could argue there is tension like this, but there is this nice move, queen c3, aiming at this bishop, and, well, white is just winning here. He suggests that perhaps you should do this Fischer-Carlson plan and play something like this, but, well, I mean, the bishop is not really supporting the g5 square, and if you try like this, you are simply too slow. In the game, he tried the move bishop b7. Well, there is logic in trying to shield the queen a bit like this, but well, it also means that the bishop becomes exposed due to a pin in the b line. So I think, I mean, blocking an open file like this is just it's just changing the problem from the queen hanging to the pin being quite discomfortable. So it's not really a solution. It's more like a one move parry of a direct threat, I would argue. So c5 happens, and well, he says that now basically it's very unpleasant. If you go queen a8, for instance, trying to sidestep like this, you can play something like this, and well, just you can see the bishop opens up to b6, and you win a pawn. If you're trying to take twice, again there is some kind of tactics which just due to the pin we win this bishop back, and we have a huge positional advantage. So after c5, the logical move is b5. It looks like it's closest to structure, but now there is a strong move c6 in this position. And yeah, he takes on a4. We're gonna take on d7. We're a pawn down at the moment, but after knight c6, you can't actually go queen a8 because of this funny move knight a7, which threatens the rook and then undermines the bishop, so it wins an exchange. And in this position, well, we are gonna get our material back on a6 directly, on a4 a little bit later, and well, when we win or sort of get rid of the a6 pawn, the b4 pawn is going to be a monster. So white is much better here. The game was something like this, and he tried knight c5, but then rook takes c7, and bc5 is just winning for white. Well, maybe it got a little bit blurry in the end, but I thought generally quite an interesting example. For a start, having had the shock of the computer engine's evaluation in the last position, it was a bit reassuring that this position is just slightly better for white. Then comes this discussion of what should white do, what should black do, and it worked quite well for black doing h5 at times, but mainly as sort of disturbing a little bit. I found this bishop g1 move quite intriguing already here, to be able to reply with h3 and put our bishop on h2 like this. That I had not seen before, but it's quite an interesting theme, and it very much gives away that, well, black would like to flick in h5, but you really have to care about circumstances. I thought it was cool that in this position, actually a move like h4 has to be taken seriously. I've never seen this as in an actual game, but the computer says white is definitely still pleasantly better here. And perhaps the strongest impression for me still with the previous example and this one is that this move bishop d8, we have to start considering as not as key an element to the hedgehog as has been previously seen. I mean, it has ended up just horribly in the last two examples, right? What else to do? Well, I spoke about it. h6, if you are brave, you want to push g5 and have a setup like this. It is possible to play like chess like this, but also that this position is just solid because, sure, black doesn't have his direct counterplay, but he has managed to sort of, postpone the advancement of these pawns. They're actually quite blocked, and then it's not so easy for white. And then when I think in the end we got to see that, especially when you have a bishop on c7, this construction becomes very powerful, opening things up on the queen side. I think we shouldn't forget that this bishop protecting this pawn is quite crucial here. So I think another good example, and while still being pretty negative from black's perspective, at least it's moving in the direction of that the hedgehog is not just losing, but we have to be careful how we do it, right? So I thought an interesting example again. If you think that the hedgehog has gotten some beating in the last examples, well, get ready for some more. I mean, our author is really having a go at explaining the full potential from white's perspective. And again, the focus is on these two rooks. It's the exact same game like last time. He's just showing that in this position, while white did win a convincing victory after taking on d7 and playing knight c6 with a good sort of positional advantage, that you don't have to take on d7 immediately. I would say that here we do have a fork, right? But also a fork which the opponent hasn't run away from. So it's actually gonna stay, which means that in this position, we can unleash even more of our force upon him. And the author suggests a brilliant move, b5. It's simply just opening the queen side as much as possible. And this really has devastating effects for black. Perhaps the reason it didn't happen in the game was, well, of course, when we can take a piece, we do it. But it looks like a move like knight c5 isn't this strong. The point being that after ba6, we can interpolate with a move like knight b3 and get some kind of relief. But there is a brilliant queen sacrifice here. C takes b7, knight takes d2, rook takes d2. To be honest, I think the author generally wanted to show this position. I can understand him. It's pretty beautiful. So the rook is hanging, and after rook d8, rook c2, we only have a piece for the queen, but we have these two pawns, and the computer says something like +5. I guess there is just no particular way for black to sort of defend against knight c6, and after this exchange, we're just going to play a7, and these pawns are just going to queen. I think I remember at some point reading a book on how they programmed computers and for playing chess. And pawns like this, obviously you have to add a massive bonus for that they could queen, especially when this square is under control and the pawns are unstoppable. So this is quite beautiful, but perhaps more a show-off than being sort of very illustrative. His main line is, bishop a8. What happens now? Well, now he takes on d7. And, now there has been this interpolation of, bishop a8 and b5. But having played b5 means that when we go knight c6 now, it comes with considerable more force. Because we can take back with the pawn. Actually, it's a cute tactical line. So if bishop takes c6, we're going to play b takes c6. And while he can take a full rook on b1, we take a knight, but at the same time we fork his rooks. So he takes our bishop on f1, and now either we take on e8 first, or we can play rook takes c7, and next move we're gonna take one of these rooks and we're gonna end up a piece. So there is some complications involved indeed, but well, the main point is that, well, having played b5, we get more firepower when we take back on c6. We're not just winning positionally, we're actually winning immediately tactically. So the computer is giving queen b7 as the best move, and now he does this Kasparov trick of going queen c1, both attacking in the c file, but also connecting these, and when these are connected, suddenly, well, we can take on a6 next without a1 hanging, right? So after queen c1, the position really starts collapsing. If you take on b5, there is this nice move knight a7, as we saw in the previous game. It attacks the base here on c8, but you can't really move it because then, well, our rook would be able to take on c7. So we win an exchange at the beginning, and we're going to win more even later. And, well, what else? He suggests that, sure, a5 could be a way to, well, radically stop that the pawn will take on a6, but unfortunately for black, the move b6 is just completely crushing here. The very basic tactical point is that, well, if you take the knight, then we're gonna go knight takes a5, and, well, if queen b8, there's just bishop a6 again, undermining well, attacking the rook on c8, which means that there's gonna be a threat on c7 if it goes away, so it wins more or less the house. And if you play the move bishop takes b6, well, there is a very simplistic check on e7, rook e7, and we can take on c8, right? So that doesn't work either. So after b6, basically the position is collapsing. Well, his main line is bishop d8, but knight takes a5, and our b pawn is going to do the job, and that's more or less it. So, well, a little bit of a show-off, I would say, but I mean, b5 is a cool move, and you get to see the power of this sort of queenside attack in full action. Why this happened? Well, due to the bishop on c7 and so on, we spoke about in the previous example. So a little bit more of an appendix, I would say, but still a pretty cool one. And of course, well, let's take a last moment to basically bow to the white passed pawn here, right? It's just a piece for a queen, but when you have pawns on a6 and b7 like this, it's really winning. I mean, I think most combinations we all get to play once in our career, but something like this, I think I have never ever come close to doing myself. So I feel a bit envious seeing this. But again, it wasn't analyzed, it's not a game. So these things happen rarely, but it do sort of, well, keep sort of pouncing these lessons that the rooks perhaps belongs in the C and B file to have attacking potential for white in the hedgehogs. So quite a cool example, I think. Our next game is by the author himself. It's Flores Rios' game against Hydra Pichan from 2013. And I think it's a great example of how you can, let's say, study the classic games, understand sort of the advanced plans of a position, and then try to incorporate it in your own game in a very successful manner. I thought, actually, let's start this game from the opening position in order to grasp and comment a bit about how do these kind of hedgehog positions sometimes actually appear, not just jump into when they have appeared. So we have a Sicilian. Black is playing the Khan defense. It's not so popular anymore. At some point, bishop d3 was considered the sort of best principal move here. But then players like the previous game we saw with Kasparov started playing the move c4. And that got to be quite a nuisance for black. Black would continue knight f6, knight c3. And then after queen c7, it will end up in a sort of hedgehog structure. Nowadays, perhaps the best move is the move bishop to b4. The problem with this move is it leads to very sad positions. So somehow players often place the Khan and they want to get a hedgehog in order to get a complicated game. But if you do like this, well, if e5, then knight e4 is quite strong. But unfortunately, there's this kind of clever move, queen to d3. And basically, well, now there is a threat of e5, and the theory goes like this: d5, an exchange like this, white develops, castles, castles, black develops, and basically this is considered sort of a forced line, but white is slightly better due to this isolated pawn, and black is quite successfully trying to make a draw. I mean, sure, if you're a top professional and this is your living, maybe this is fine. But if you're an amateur player actually wanting to have an interesting game, perhaps not, right? So this is not why we play the Khan and the Sicilian. So Queen c7 is kind of the move. And then this clever move a3 became very popular. And, well, the idea obviously is that we want to control bishop b4 not being an option. But we're still, while we have, you can argue, is this really relevant? It's somewhat relevant, but it is still wasting time. But it seems like black cannot manage to hit at the white center well enough, so we're going to get a hedgehog structure. Black goes b6, bishop to e3, bishop b7, and now the move f3, just sort of solidly covering this base. Sometimes black can play a move like bishop d6 to attack here, but in this position, well, because we have a pawn on a3, right? There's no check on b4, so this tactic just works. Well, white is just winning here. So black goes bishop to e7, and then, well, white can even flick in this move rook to c1. It both takes the sting out of d5, and sometime when black would play a move like knight c6, perhaps not directly here, we can start considering a move like knight d5, because like this we're going to win something, the piece back in the c line, and knight f5 will happen later with quite a positional advantage. So rook c1 was basically considered, well, also a key part of this concept. Black castles, bishop e2. And now, I think these days, it's probably considered that black should play knight c6 and then exchange on d4 and have a decent position. And I think it turns out that knight d5 is not particularly efficient here. But again, it's more like an expert play to get a sort of decently playable position. For us, the really relevant part is d6, as happens in the game, and getting a hedgehog. Now, our offer castles, which is a quite reasonable move. But computers actually are saying that, well, maybe you should just actually start pushing an attack like g4. This is a very typical way to attack like this in a Sicilian, right? But we normally would combine it with long castling. But here we have already played the move rook to c1. The computer seems to not care too much. They are debating, should we go g4 here directly, but now perhaps you can play a move like knight fd7 and threatening a check here. Then there is a move like h4, and the game goes on. Or it even says that in this position, perhaps you could start with the move queen to d2, and if knight d7, then to play the move g4. Black is not lost or considerably worse here, but it's quite interesting and somewhat pleasant for white, I would argue, but an interesting position. There is another move, perhaps not played directly in this position, but in a similar position by Jordan van Forest. And please don't fall down from your chair when I show it. It's the move king to d2. Yeah, well, what do you want me to say? It looks obviously ridiculous. And, I mean, but the idea is that, yeah, we would like to castle long, and we would like to have our rook on c1. And sure, it takes a little bit of time, but, well, if we would castle long, I mean, we would still have to play king b1 and rook c1 afterwards, right? So just, I mean, doing like this is not insane at all. It's actually, for a start, white is not worse at all here. White is doing fine. And according to the computer, if black just plays, let's say, normal chess like this, white is actually going to get his way. He's going to put the king here and play g4 with a very nice position. The computer wants us to go rook d8, and if king c2, then strike immediately with d5. Well, that almost looks too good to be true, right? We have a rook attacking in the d file like this, and the queen is attacking towards our king. But of course, white is going to take and do the move king b1 when this rook come into play. And it's only because black can play bishop c5 and after b4 sacrifice a piece like this, the computer says the position is quite equalish here. But you can see a very specific response is needed for black just to get a decent position. So the move king d2, I thought, well, this is modern chess with artificial intelligence, as fun as it is. Well, maybe it's just me who thinks it's funny, but I mean, this is why I love chess moves like king d2, right? I mean, it's things that, well, you know, imagine a non-genius player playing it, we would just laugh at it and say, of course you can't play chess like that, but you actually can. Well, in this game, well, this is 2013, quite reasonably, they were not ready for such. So for Riz, he just castled the natural way, not the weird way we are sort of artificially weird d2. And knight bd7, b4, rook a c8, king h1. We have a very standard position. The king goes back to, sorry, queen goes back to b8, he goes queen d2. And now, well, we can see this bishop d2, sorry, bishop d8, it happens here as well. This is just so inbuilt in our understanding of this position at the time that you see so many doing it. I mean, well, I made the point again, it's not weak players doing it, it's Kramnik as well. And this is just how the position was understood. The game goes rook to c2 and now bishop to c7. And, well, that's very logical. Bishop g1 happens. Bishop g1 is also, it's a very sensible move. He has a great position. In the sort of, well, in the next example, we will see another move being played here. But I want to make a point that the computer prefers the move g4 here. It doesn't, I mean, why would it waste time to sort of start defending something like this? It basically thinks I can just push for an attack. And if you start opening with d5, I'm going to kick your knight with g5 myself. The computer says the best way to fight is g6. And after f4, sorry, like here, you have to go back like this. And perhaps now, well, there is some exposure in this diagonal. Well, the other way around, obviously, right? Towards the king, and it says maybe you should play a move like king to g1 now, and it assesses the position as being quite better for white. A point is that, sure, you can do queen a8 and put pressure on this pawn, but the pressure is not real, because you can't, I mean, well, you can't take it because your queen is going to be trapped. And basically, a position like this, well, rook f8, you start pushing h4, and the computer thinks white is quite better here. I guess, again, part of it is that these pieces, well, they are supposed to sort of attack toward the white center and the king in the diagonals. But if that doesn't work out, they are really very far away from the king on g8, which means it's a very legitimate target for white. So g4, actually a cool move here. But, well, he plays very classically. He goes bishop to g1. He makes the point here that, well, you should always, as I said, watch out for, is it possible to do equalizing breaks like this, or it could be more than equalizing. But here he says that it seems not to be the case. He just wanted to take, and even after this interpolation, queen d1, e takes d5, he just wants to take on d5, and we see there is an exchange like this, and it's gonna end up with a pawn falling on a6. And while black has liberated his position, and you can argue that these bishops looks nice, the white position is solid and a pawn up, so that doesn't really work. So he goes rook f to e8. Black jumps with knight to a4. And here, I think, another typical thing. If you break with d5, let's say takes, the correct move is c5, just keeping the queen side closed. And we see again, I mean, I think we debated in the introduction to the Kasparov game, that this knight becomes very efficient behind this pawn. So it's just a huge positional edge for white. So the game was knight a4, knight e5, also typical. Rook f to c1. He makes the argument that perhaps you could even play a move like c5 in this position. And the idea again is b5. You take and you jump to a square like this. But, well, he plays the move rook f to c1 here. And now, well, knight c6 happens. He's just trying to make an exchange. And here we get to sort of the sequence the author, well, I think rightfully is very proud of, but also that's why he sort of includes the game into sort of this book. Normally, I think when you have so much more space, keeping pieces on the board is a good strategy. I remember, well, we'll get to that in the Marakshi chapter, but I had a game with Gulko where he sort of managed to keep all the minor pieces on the board compared to only 3 of them. And he told me it really limits the black position. And that's generally true here as well, but there is exceptions. And our author takes on c6. And now he follows up with a very, very cool move. He plays the move b5, and it looks very ugly at first. It really, I mean, well, suddenly, I mean, this, I would say, should be red, not green. Well, in reality, they are green, they are good, but it looks like they're really weakening the structure. It also means that it completely concedes the c5 square. I mean, if this knight could magically jump there, black's position would be immediately very, very good. But that's not the case. The problem is that black is facing immediate concrete problems and there's no decent solution to it. If you start, let's say, exchanging, well, there is a simple tactic, but when you take back on b6, we're just going to swap everything on c8. I'm going to take back on b6 with an extra pawn in the end, and of course, we'll be winning due to our passed pawns. So it creates immediate problems. In the game, he tries bishop to a8. If you go bishop b7, in order to keep the pawn on a6 protected, well, your downfall will be that the bishop is unprotected on a6. We have this threat, and well, if you take on e2, we will take on b6 first and just sort of exploit this tactical opportunity. And if you play a move like let's say b5, well, you can take on d6 and you kind of win tactically, but I even prefer more the move he mentioned, the move c6, just cementing this pawn, and you can't take on a6 on a4 because a6 will be having. It's also a disaster basically. So he plays the move bishop to a8, and now after takes, knight to d7, rook to b1. White is just well, much better. I think the game was something like this, and White has a considerable advantage here. I think he took on c7 and on d6 and won the game later. It's perhaps not too relevant. It's just an extra pawn, and b6 is weak, right? So I thought b5. It is. It's a very strong move. I don't know how to describe it. Perhaps it's typical thing in chess that, well, they say in order to break down your opponent's defenses, sometimes you have to do moves that looks ugly. I think, well, some are saying that if you want to make an omelette, you have to break an egg. It's perhaps not a one-to-one translatable image to have in your mind, but it's. I think, well, it was Larsen who told it to me that this sort of process of breaking down your opponent's position means you will do things that doesn't look perhaps beautiful. I mean, here we have a very beautiful structure, right? And then sometimes, well, we are doing b5 and it's going to do considerable damage to our opponent's position, which is really what matters. But it still feels uncozy for me. It's something that it's almost like you have to break something within yourself, right? You're doing considerable damage to your pawn structure, but maybe it's also, I think it was Vallejo said at some point that, well, don't worry. When you start the next game, your pawn structure will be completely perfect again. So sometimes you have to break things in order to win at chess. I thought generally a cool example. I think, we saw some, well, of course, moves like king d2 and g4 is something, if we want to have a very modern understanding of the hedgehog, it's important. Perhaps it's not important for the generic positions, but also the generic position has to happen by some kind of concrete move order. And here, moves like this definitely have to be understood. I guess we got to see again that bishop d8 is something that we have to do with much more caution than was originally thought when people sort of started to enjoy playing the hedgehog. It seems to be, well, there will be examples where it's a good idea, but quite often it's quite suboptimal at all. I think even in this position, the computer says, why don't we go back to d8 and put the bishop on e7? Well, that's, I mean, actually literally giving away 4 tempi simply because of that one being misplaced. And perhaps I forgot to mention, but I've also here, the computer wants to play again the move like h5, at least to get some kind of counterplay against this structure to force a concession and things like this. But generally, I think a cool example and a great game by our author. I can understand why he is rightfully proud of having played the move b5, and also, well, it's a great example, as I mentioned. It's someone who has studied the Kasparov classic, but also, well, you should not just copy the classic. You should incorporate their knowledge and then to try and use it concretely. And this is exactly what he did, and got rewarded with a win. So fully deserved win for Flores Rios here. In our next example, we are staying within the Flores Rios against High-Repetchan game. But, I mean, the author has a very interesting thought here in this position. And I think it's a good example of, well, he doesn't say it specifically, but my best guess is it's a good example of how studying chess with an engine can actually help you. In general, studying chess with an engine can also harm you. I mean, one thing, for instance, if you do it during a chess tournament, you look at your games, you will end up losing all kind of confidence, because an engine is a all-seeing beast, especially in the time of recording in 2024 here, that sees more or less everything, and humans are not that good. So you will basically get this impression that you're not a very strong chess player, which hopefully is not necessarily correct. And that is generally a problem. I recall it very much myself, that when I looked at my games during events, I would sort of go into depression, and many people has mentioned that factor. The problem is that we would like to understand chess better, and engines is an incredible tool for that. I mean, well, in sort of preparing for doing this course in this position, I turned on the engine, and the engine said the move g4 is the best, right? Would you start, looking at that if you didn't have an engine going? Probably not. Or maybe you would, but you will be much more skeptical in a way. I mean, skepticism is good, but also engines can really speed up the process, I think. And I guess it's the same that happened here, that Flores Rios has looked at his game. He did it very well. He won a beautiful game, as we saw in the previous example. But analyzing the game, I guess he realized that the engines would even suggest a move b5 here. He would think, whoa, that is ugly. I mean, if you recall in the previous example, I said that, well, b5 is a nice move, perhaps, but imagine if this knight can jump to c5 and block. Well, actually, it can do it here. So how can a move like b5 be good? It goes basically against everything we are taught, also even in this position, right? I mean, we made the point, if the rook was on b1 and circumstances was much better, perhaps we would push the move b5. But here, really, well, it turns out that, yeah, it's actually a pretty decent move. Well, part of it is that we want to get access to the b5 square with a knight, and like this, well, when we take on a6, we're going to remove the only, let's say, strong defender of the b5 square. For instance, let's say knight c5, we take on a6. You can't take with the bishop because of knight c6 jumping here and, well, forking the queen, and like that, it's going to win an exchange. So after knight a6, we're going to put a knight on b5 and actually keep considerable sort of pressure on this structure. And this knight on b5 is quite... well, it's uncontestable, right? Sure, black will have a knight on the c5 square, but we are claiming our knight on b5 has more actual purpose. So knight c5 is not ideal. Of course, a very critical test would be, can black play the move a5? It turns, well, of course he can. And then later, I mean, well, his dream is he will get the c5 square, and we are not going to get the b5 square. That is the dream scenario for black, but unfortunately for him, we move in turns. So we jump to c6 immediately. Then takes happens, and knight e5. And now this pawn on c6 is very weak. But the author's point is that that actually doesn't seem to matter much. We can play knight b5, and after knight takes c6, we go knight b2. And, well, we are gonna take on c7 and win the pawn on b6. Or should the bishop retreat, then we'll win the pawn on d6. He gives the knight to d7, and now he exchanges like this and goes rook d1, and he says we're gonna pick up the pawn on d6. So there's no way he can stop us from doing that. And then we're gonna have the pair of bishops, and the pawn on b6 is still gonna be weak, with a considerable advantage for white, which seems true. So that is quite nice. But, well, I do the same as the author. I have the engine running when I'm studying the games. And I could not help to notice that the computer says, even in this position, why don't we go g4? I think, okay, well, you lose a pawn. It doesn't seem to care. It wants to play f4 and says knight d7, h4. White is quite better here. Well, white is a pawn down. There is no debate about that. And he also has a weak queenside structure. But I guess the positive outlook is that we have basically not a free attack because we'll sacrifice the pawn, but we have a free attack in terms of it's not realistic to do counterplay with d5 or b5. So the king side is very much ours. We have a bunch of space there, and we are just gonna most likely push these pawns and somehow open files. Black's attack, or rather counter-attack, is normally on the queen side. But this structure means that b5 is not going to happen. And the d5 square is also, well, he's not going to push d5. And very typically, there would be a bishop on b7 attacking our king. But this has sort of disappeared. Well, don't blame me, blame the computer. But it actually says that white is doing very, very well here. So a5 is the move you would generally like to play to sort of not let white get access to the b5 square, but it seems not to be very good here. So he suggests a move, well, bishop d8, and now let's say takes, knight to b5 is the point. Again, well, this knight just becomes very powerful in terms of it actually attacks the pawn on d6. And, well, I mentioned before, this knight on c5, it's going to look nice there, but it's attacking a pawn that's extremely well defended, while the pawn on d6 is actually a real weakness. Now, for some reason, he goes knight e8 in his analysis. I think bishop e7 is a much more logical move, but let's say rook b1, rook fd8, covering things quite nicely. Still, after a move like a4, we're going to follow up with a5, and there's going to be some sort of annoyance, well, with the queen being exposed here, and let's say he takes on a5, we'll have the moves like knight a7 winning an exchange. So even this is not pleasant for black at all. And no, it's instructive that even playing with weak pawns like this, getting access to the b5 square actually seems to be more relevant. He sort of enhances it a bit by, well, he goes knight e8, rook b1, knight c5. Of course, the bishop on d8 is protecting this pawn, but it still seems rather clumsy. And now he suggests that, well, rook b2, and I think there is some sort of pressure against the pawn on b6. Let's just skittle a couple of moves here. That's sort of what he gives, and now, yeah, okay, e5 is a random tactic. Let's ignore that. But basically, it's a pleasant position. You start attacking the b6 pawn. It's not winning, but it's very interesting, and I think that's really the beauty of computer analysis, that we get to understand chess better simply, and we should enjoy that. But of course, I mean, not everybody is just a second/author like me, who basically not have to play myself. I have to understand things as well as I can. So I think engines is a great tool for understanding. For the practical player, of course, it has to be balanced to some extent. But, well, I hope you thought it interesting that in this position, I mean, well, sure, you can have good positional instincts, and you want to keep, well, I would say you want to keep your port chain solid like this or solid like this. But the moves we are discussing are either g4 attacking or b5 attacking. So I think that's interesting modern chess, right? And very relevant. It's still, I mean, as we've spoken out before, if you have to break down your opponent's position, at some time you have to do somewhat ugly things. So very interesting sort of input from our author here, I think. Our next example is from 2013. It's Predojevic against Nestorovic. I really like the example in terms of that. Well, I almost feel deceived by my childhood knowledge, and I think the author does the same. This position looks, well, quite typical from sort of the initial stages of the Hedgehog. Let's sort of ignore that white haven't played the move a3, which Kasparov was recommending, and that might have, maybe black should have played bishop b4 earlier. But let's ignore that. Now black plays the move d6. And our author says that's actually a considerable mistake. There is truth in that, but the reason that we were told it's a mistake is quite dubious, I would say. The right move is actually the move bishop e7. And, well, we will get to why this is a mistake, why this is the correct move over in a bit. If you turn on the computer here, it will just say, sure, d6 is weak, let's go g4 and start attacking. And then, well, you have played d6 too early, it claims. That seems to be true, but that's sort of the advanced understanding of modern chess. What we were told was that, well, if you do it like this, a4 becomes very, very strong. And the reason you should do bishop e7 is that after a4 you could still play the move knight to c6 and keeps things controlled, and then somehow the a4 becomes a bit of a weakness. When after d6 you can go a4 and you will punch forward with the pawn to a5. This is it's really common knowledge. I mean, you can see that it was common knowledge. The author had it. I had it independently. Everybody knew that this is how you do things. And well, the idea is, let's say bishop e7, you push a5, and basically you break the structure. So they take on a5, and you go queen a4 check. It's not like white is not better here, but less better than well, we thought. So knight fd7, then now an exchange here and just castling. The game goes king f2, which is the logical move. But, well, I guess by now that I really love to turn on the computer and be puzzled at times. And the computer actually think maybe you should be closer to the center with the king. Well, that is generally quite typical, but in a sort of Sicilian structure, it strikes me as weird. Here on f2, the king just looks cozy, right? It's combining the mix of being somewhat closer to the center while still feeling completely safe. While on d2, it does look exposed in the d file to me. But, well, who am I to sort of disagree with modern sort of artificial intelligence? So apparently you can put a king on d2 here. But this position, well, we were also just brought up to believe that white is considerably better here, that we have a healthy pawn structure, and especially, well, this pawn on a6 is weak, and we're going to use the a file. It seems not to be too big a deal. Computer goes rook c8, and the game is rook c1, and now he does a mistake. He plays knight c6 when suddenly takes b4. Actually, well, white is going to push with b5 and potentially later get a past b pawn and be quite better. But the computer is suggesting just, well, as mentioned in the book, knight e5, b3. And now, not mentioned in the book, but just the move knight b to d7. And here black seems to be quite decently fine. It's difficult for white to make easily progress. I mean, this knight is sort of keeping an eye on the pawn on c4 so that you cannot progress like this. And also, if you start sort of pushing it away with f4, you start weakening your pawn on e4. Well, white is slightly better, no doubt about that. But this idea that allowing the opponent to play a4 and a5, it was basically considered like lack of classical chess knowledge. It was just, well, you play the Hedgehog, but you don't even know this. This is kind of ridiculous. But this seems to be somewhat antiquated. the conclusion still stands that bishop e7 is a better move order to be more flexible if white doesn't do the standard moves. Let's say, castling. But after d6, probably the best way to punish is the move g4, not the move a4. I understand that perhaps you will argue that, well, the hedgehog is a solid opening and we try to play positionally and attack later on the queen side. And that could be true, but it could also be a very aggressive opening, as we see, and you can play it with the g4 under the correct circumstances. So, no, this is, again, perhaps even like the first example we saw Kasparov-Kramnik, that I feel that some of my childhood knowledge and even the knowledge in the book seems to be just somewhat antiquated. Not in the full sense, but at least I think modern engines really enhances white advantage, and it shows that, for instance, well, g4 seems to be quite powerful, and that a4, while being sound and solid, and an extra option you have gotten due to this sort of dubious d6 move, it's also what we would call underplaying the position, that it's not wrong, and it's still pleasantly better, but you are not maxing out on your advantage, and it's a little bit perhaps cowardly to play like this when you have even stronger options like g4. Or you could of course argue it's just a matter of style, and they're both quite pleasant. So it's useful to know this plan a4, a5, but it's also useful to know that it's not that powerful, but again, well, you shouldn't really allow it, so you should go bishop e7 first, I would argue. So anyway, perhaps not too relevant, but at least for me personally, this was quite interesting and managed to really make my understanding of this position much more exact. Our next example changes not the pawn structure, but the piece configuration quite a bit. It's Elyanov against Yakovenko from the World Cup in 2013. And our author asks great questions here. He basically says that, haven't we all been brought up with that when we lack space, we should make exchanges? Because when we are sort of confined space-wise, it means that, well, we have less ground to maneuver and our pieces would typically start tripping over each other. And that's generally true. And, but his point is that in the hedgehog, not necessarily like that. His point is that black is basically sort of typically aiming for counterplay. And that counterplay is very much connected with the d5 break. But due to the exchanges, actually, white gets a much better control of the d5 square. And I guess also part of it, you can argue, is why is it that black doesn't suffer that much from sort of the lack of space, despite having as many pieces as possible on the board. But I guess you can argue, well, the bishop has a spot on b7, the knights on d7 and f6, and the bishop on e7, and rooks e8 or c8 or d8, and the queen somewhere around c7 and b8. There is actually a very clear distribution of where the pieces should stand. So while the black setup is cramped, it's not cramped to the extent that it becomes horrible for black. He's not suffocating in any way. And that means apparently in this hedgehog structures that sometimes when exchanges happens, it just means the black counterplay becomes worse. And well, you can see white can put a pawn on a4. There will be no b5 break, and the d5 break is also under control. I mean, we're really lacking this bishop on b7 shooting towards the white king. How bad is it is, of course, a relevant question. And I think quite bad is the reasonable answer to this. I mean, how should you deal with black in this position? Well, the author mentioned that if you go e5, well, we're transposing into a previous chapter. This d5 square is just very weak. I mean, e5 would be a horrible move, no doubt. And d5, well, you can't do it. We're just going to take. And now, a very simple move, bishop takes f6, and after taking back, we can take on d5, and white has a healthy extra pawn and is winning. So it's difficult being black here. A typical move is the one he does in the game. He plays the move knight to e8. It covers the pawn on d6, so that the position is more stable. and it gets ready to make another exchange with the bishop to f6, somehow freeing the queen to get to e7 and perhaps, well, continuing to exchange. The game goes queen e2, bishop to f6. And now Elyanov retreats with bishop e3, which is logical in terms of, well, keeping some pieces on the board to be able to win. But actually, it's a mistake. The book says that it was safer to play rook to d3, but it would actually just be quite better, says the computer. After rook to d3, the advantage is like plus 0.9, a really considerable advantage. And I thought a very instructive line was something like this. So takes a6, insinuating a possibility of b5. We're just going to ignore that, sort of, well, make sure it doesn't happen. So we go a4. And after queen e7, I really thought it's clever how white is doing it here via the computer. He goes doubling in the d file. Let's say rook b7 to get some space for the queen. Rook 1 to d3, queen c7. And, well, this sort of constellation is, it looks a little bit clumsy, but you can never really play e5 and trap it, because there will be a rook square on d5. And you cannot really release this knight either, because then d6 would be hanging. And in this position, we would start pushing on the king side. The computer wants to play h4, g4, and somehow the rook on the third file is going to help with that. And like, there is not enough white, sort of black pieces to create counterplay. There is also only one piece to defend the king in a way. So this position is actually very, very unpleasant. And I think very thematic, because, well, it has this kind of generic character, right? It can happen all the time, but basically a free set of pieces is exchanged, and we have a very bare structure, but a very unpleasant one for black. So I think it's important to understand that this position is very unpleasant, and it's a interesting theme. We will also see it in the Maroczy position, which is going to be our next chapters, that there is some positions where, well, despite being behind in space, if you exchange way too many pieces, you're actually still going to suffer tremendously. And this is a good example. Elyanov played the move bishop e3, very logical. And queen e7, rook to d3 happened. And this actually gives black a chance. Black could just take on c3 now, just get rid of the pair of bishops. But in this position, there is a chance to play d5. And this basically equalizes the position. I mean, something like, let's say this, there will be exchanges, and while you can make a slight argument for the bishop being better than the knight, I think the queen side is still solid. The knight goes to f6, and the queen will appear in this diagonal with the slightly exposing of the king. This is a fairly solid position for black, nothing to really worry about. He didn't take on c3, he went rook d to d8 instead. And now, the position is back to the same status. We'll fast forward a bit. So a couple of moves like this here. And I think this is perhaps the last interesting moment from black's perspective. The author makes the remark that the white position is rock solid, and black has nothing better to do than just to wait. But that actually turns out to be wrong in this exact position. I mean, well, we can see that you have a queen sort of aiming against the king, but there is this very solid construction defending it. But black could play the move knight to f6, and we start perhaps insinuating opening with d5. It's not a threat immediately, but let's say if you do something like h4 in the game, the knight will jump back to d7 and actually start reaching the c5 square, where it's going to attack not only the rook on d3, but the pawn on b3. And after knight f6, it seems like the specifics of the position is actually quite in black's favor, and he should be almost equal, the computer is saying. But I think that's more, it's a bit of a random element rather than a sort of general feature. Yakovenko, luckily for us, goes bishop f6, and we get to see how things sort of happens. h4, rook c6, and now a good move, bishop to d4. So Elyanov basically reverses on his previous strategy of keeping more pieces on the board. He's willing to swap this the pair of bishops. And here, it's just a very sad position. So rook goes back, and now, well, he starts expanding on the king side. G4, rook C5, rook backs here a bit, queen to E7, queen to F2. And probably it would be better for black to wait now. But he sort of gets scared of white perhaps expanding even further with F4, so he does the move G5. But it's one of these examples where probably the medicine is sort of stronger than, well, is more damaging than the actual sort of disease, right? So there is an exchange, and queen to D4. Now there starts becoming threat of rook H1. And of course it should be noted that black cannot do the logical queen F6 because, well, that would lead to this one dropping. And I guess we start to feel that, well, the lack of pieces on the board means that some pawns like this and this are less protected. I mean, if there was a bishop on E7, we would not have to care about the D6 pawn. But here, actually, this knight is very much needed for this defensive purpose, which limits black's play a lot. He tries to move rook 8 to C6. I guess the author mentions that queen F8 perhaps is logical getting the queen here. But then there's a strong move A5. The idea is if you take with the rook, we can take this weak pawn on B6, and your rook is starting to feel uncomfortable. And if you take with the pawn, then we're going to go knight A4. And if rook C6, then the nice move E5, and after the D file is opened, it's going to be very, very dominant for white. Will start intruding, and somehow, while being a pawn down, I would argue that this construction is very, very comfortable for white, and these pawns on the A file doesn't matter too much. So a considerable advantage. Okay. Games was like this, and now the knight reshuffle itself to B4, and soon won some material. I think now, yeah, the game was like this. White is a pawn up and is quite easily winning. It doesn't really matter. I think the key message is that, well, a position like this is not just solid for black. It's actually quite unpleasant. And well, even I think later this bishop b5 check Sicilian became very possible, sort of very popular based on some of Magnus's games. And there is some similarities to this, that when white has this kind of hedgehog center, black cannot just be solid. He needs to have quite some activity for counterattack. And this activity actually very often comes from having numerous minor pieces, which is lacking here. And I thought very instructive was, well, you know, that you actually don't want to even keep the bishops. It would be better to have a position like this. I mean, this is a position one should understand and generally feel that this is much better for white. That's also somewhat counterintuitive to me. But when you start moving around the pieces with a computer, you start to grasp how unpleasant it is. Or, well, I think at some point there was another kind of position from the Sicilian I spoke with Vishy Anand about when I was working for him, and I said, come on, black is solid here. And he said, well, try playing this position in a game. If you have to sit and defend this for 3 hours, you start realizing how unpleasant it is. And I think, well, play a game like black here, and you will start to realize this is just no fun at all. So I think a very good example showing us this concept of that while we are taught that exchanges helps you, if you are on the defending side, if you have less space, that is generally correct, but Hedgehog is kind of an exception, and I think this game shows it quite beautifully. Our next example is basically a case study of black's potential in the Hedgehog structure. It's a game between Dominguez and Andrakin from the Capablanca Memorial in 2011. Both sort of sub-world elite players, very, very strong. But here, Dominguez gets very much into trouble. It's black to move, and I think, well, I spoiled it already. This position is about pushing d5 for black, and I think it's a great example because it shows the incredible strength black's position can have when sort of all the pieces comes to play. Well, that's more or less the point of the Hedgehog, that while it's sort of a somewhat passive opening, right? You're staying on your side of the board, even basically the own sort of not your own half, but your free back ranks. But the hope is that at some point you will unveil this kind of huge potential counterplay, and this is a great example of that. We can look at this position, just some details before we start. This rook on c5 is perhaps a bit oddly placed, right? There's a threat to watch it. And I would argue also that, well, these pawns are a bit weird in a way. I mean, it perhaps, I would say, it weakens the white pawn structure a bit, but in return, he's gotten the b5 square, where his knight stately sort of attacks in this direction. So it's hard to say who this favors. As well, we have a typical pawn on h4 here. It can be a weakness, but it can also be a strength, and this position very much a strength. But anyway, let's get to the action. So black does the move d5, and it basically starts really unleashing the power of the black position. Perhaps if we sort of have to sum it up very quickly, it opens sort of firepower towards the king on h1, particularly the bishop here, but it's a too simplified way of describing it. I think we have to look into the details to actually understand the concept fully. Well, first of all, it's an exchange sacrifice, and I think it makes sense understanding that taking on c5, it's not a matter of black having compensation here. It's a matter of black being completely winning. So bishop takes c5, black takes back just, and after queen takes h4, we take on e4. It's a full exchange, and white can even get a pawn back on e4, but it's noteworthy. The computer thinks this is just dead lost for black. Logical perhaps would be to, why not exchange even further? But, I mean, again, the problem was that, well, I wanted to make this point that, it opens up for this bishop towards the king, but it becomes too simplistic. For instance, in this position, you take on e4 with the bishop, and when they take back, you go knight to g4, because, well, you actually want to attack the f2 square like this. And this position is just really dead lost. Well, you can do something like g3, but then rook d2 starts basically attacking like this, and there's no reasonable defense. Rook c2 perhaps looks logical, right? Why not defend the f2 square like this? But after something like queen e5, well, you threaten the rook on a1, it's probably going to go to c1, and now, well, it doesn't depend on just one move, but let's say g5 here is really dead lost for white. There's no reasonable way to defend. I mean, we're having this threat on h2 of mate, and if you go queen g3, just to sort of show it, then king g7, and the rook comes there, and the king gets mated because we have a strong bishop on c5, right? So after bishop takes c5 takes, queen takes h4, we take here. Well, the book mentions that you could also play, well, fe4 is his preferred move, but he says even here, knight to g4, it's generally hopeless. There is this threat of a check on f2, and after rook c2, again, there is a lot of moves winning for black. Black is generally winning here. It doesn't depend on the specifics, but his preferred way is this, and just wants to go king g7, rook h8, and basically black just wins outright. So I think it's cool to understand that a position like this, it just wins for black simply. And it's because all this power is being unleashed. I would point to, these things, but even as we saw after something like g6, king g7, the rook can join here, and it's basically a devastating force that starts swarming towards the black king here, and I would argue that all these pieces on the queen side for white is very much out of play. So that's really the hope of playing d5. So taking the exchange on c5 is bad. It becomes too easy. How could white sort of try and spoil it? Well, the author mentions perhaps doing it like this and now trying to exchange as much as possible. The line he gives is something like bishop takes d5, And he says that now, well, black starts its equal material and black is doing quite well. But he mentions that you take, and now, realistically speaking, you should sacrifice the exchange back, and maybe this position is not too bad. And I think the computer agrees with him. But if we jump back to here, black can just do quite normal means and sort of get out. Well, it's not like he's afraid of losing the exchange. On the contrary, he's afraid of white sacrificing back the exchange, as we saw. And, well, the rook gets out of the way, and after bishop takes b6, another very typical move, h3, trying to sort of, well, again, undermine this diagonal and open for the black attack. And this position, computer says, is just a winning for black. You shouldn't have taken on b6 here, but even, well, if he gets a normalized position like that, black is just positionally better. I would argue that, well, there is this constant threat of h3, and black is just better centralized here. So it is a good idea to try and exchange some pieces, but black is doing very well anyway. In the game after d5, Dominguez took on d5 like this, take back, and now, well, he probably miscalculates the consequences now. Perhaps the best was to take the exchange, and after queen h4, the author starts debating taking on c4, but, well, white is kind of okay here. I checked with the computer. It even wants to just go d4 and play it positionally and says black is better. Again, we get to this thing that, sure, white is material up, but all these pieces start to have enormous potential. White is not lost here. I think the computer says if you go knight d5, you're actually fighting on quite reasonably. But I think it's still a powerful image that, well, you can be a full exchange down, but you have so strong pieces, well, you actually exchange and a pawn down, that the compensation is so massive that mainly by positional means or not long-term tactics, but also not very short-term tactics, black's position is more than okay. It's quite interesting and quite typical of the Hedgehog. In this position, Dominguez took on d5, and he was probably hoping that, well, things will start exchanging on d5, and maybe things would not be too bad for him. But Andreikin does something very typical. I mean, well, the pawn did go to h4 for a reason. He plays the move h3 now. And, well, I understand that there is some pieces in between, but it's basically the idea of, well, this becomes problematic for black at some point. And I would argue here, kind of sooner than later. Of course, yeah, white can win material in some ways. For instance, well, you can take the exchange now. Maybe actually he should, says the computer. Something like this. But, well, there is huge compensations in a number of ways. Perhaps you should go knight d3 immediately, actually. But even, I think the book gives a line like this, attacking the queen. And now the move knight to d3 and a position like this. Black has awesome compensation. Again, an exchange and a pawn down. But, well, these knights are beautiful, right? This one is attacking the king. The king is weak on h1. The bishop is weak on g2. I think computer says it's no doubt full compensation for black here. And in the practical game, of course, black would have quite promising possibilities. But it's not a decided game at all. Well, Dominguez, an incredibly strong player, actually sort of gets lost in the complications here. But it's, I think, while the computer is not sort of completely going overboard in saying black is winning here, it's a very, very unpleasant situation for white, no doubt. I mean, it's him who has to play very well. It's black who has all the fun. So rook d1 happened, and he took back on d5. Again, I think for illustrative purposes, the book mentions that if you do like this, just exchanging something like this, it's black is winning. I guess it's easier to understand now. We have seen examples where basically, you know, you get activity like this, you're undermining the king, and you can sacrifice quite some material and still be doing well. Here is actually equal material. it is just logical that, well, white doesn't have any kind of prospects here. His king side is going to be sort of crippled in a positional sense, and black just has excellent pieces. So what black is actually winning here, but I guess it's a good point to illustrate that if all other things are equal in terms of material and, well, exchanges and pawns, obviously it's great for black. Dominguez, I guess, decides that, well, if I'm gonna suffer, why not be an exchange up? But it's probably based on a miscalculation. So the game goes like this. He goes queen to g3, and then just a nice move, the simplistic move, knight takes c3 here. White should have taken back on c3, and after something like this, bishop d4, there is more than sufficient compensation. It's actually white who has to play very well to keep some drawing chances here. But, well, Dominguez had another idea. He thought that he could exchange rooks like this and then take back on e5. If you take on c3 here, it seems like queen d4 is winning. There is actually a threat of queen g1 mate and also threats in this direction. But queen takes e5 was his point, and most likely he missed the next move because it's a very simple move when you see it, but it's a very atypical move. I mean, well, it's easy to see that the knight on f2 would be crushing, but that there's actually a route via d1 is atypical. Normally we would go via the e4 square, right? But this is protected here. But on d1, there's just no reasonable way to defend knight to f2. He tried rook a2, but after knight e3, we are attacking this one, but more sort of critically, he can't move it because then, well, things would be dropping on g2. So the game was knight c3, he took on f1, and, well, white, sort of black now has 2 pieces for a rook, but they're still winning on positionally on the king side, right? I mean, this structure is sort of collapsing again. So he won in a couple of moves from here. I think this part is not interesting. I thought it's a great example in general. It shows really the power of the move d5. But I thought there was a few peculiarities in the structure, so I was a little bit curious to sort of look at them. I think in this position, well, black plays the move a5. We saw that this sort of unusual structure appeared, right? I checked with the computer. There's absolutely nothing wrong with just, let's say, playing a standard move like this. It's not like white is very much threatening to do a5 next. But there's nothing wrong with a5 either. It's not like the computer jumps in terms of evaluation or anything like this. And this is rather unusual, allowing this knight to b5. But it's a typical, I would say, well, give and take situation that, sure, white gets this incredibly beautiful square on b5, not only beautiful but quite useful because it's a permanent knight on b5, but it also attacks sort of a very crucial part of black's camp. But, well, due to white not being fully in time, he cannot win the d6 pawn. I mean, if he could create some kind of well, direct trouble towards d6 and force black into passivity, it would be very different. That's what he tries. But let's say after bishop f4, which was the game, black is in time to go knight e5. There's a counter threat to c4, and after b3, rook fd8. The position is quite healthy for black. There was one more moment I thought was quite instructive. King h1, very typical. Well, while it is indeed into this diagonal, well, this is still a sort of, well, not long-term, but sort of semi-long-term consideration. Having the king on g1, on the contrary, well, there could be a check at any moment. So this is, well, I mean, you have to voluntarily go to h1. It's a safer square than g1. And while, well, this ends up badly half of the time for white, that is, well, it is a necessity to put it on h1 because, well, the check on c5 you cannot constantly have to worry about. In this position, Andreikin played h5, and that worked out brilliant for him, as we saw. But the computer actually doesn't like it, and I'll explain why in a second. But let's take the good move first. knight f2 d7 is very, very logical. You want to put the knight on c5. It's attacking the b3 pawn. And while, well, I said this is a beautiful knight that attacks, let's say, some kind of critical structure of black, then this pawn is very comfortably defended. When this knight gets to c5, it's actually attacking the pawn on b3, and that one you have to defend in a slightly uncomfortable way, I would argue. So knight fd7 would be a great move. And Dragon played the move h5, and I was very surprised to see what the computer suggested for white here. Well, we have seen something a bit similar in an earlier example, but h5 is really supposed to be a great move here in general. But the computer says that after h3, white is actually considerably better. And part of it is that, well, you can play d5 now actually, but after takes, bishop to h2, it is surprisingly awkward for black. It's really not supposed to be, because, well, it's black who's attacking like this. But let's say taking on c4, then queen e3, and actually suddenly the tactic starts getting reversed. It becomes very uncomfortable for black here. It's very peculiar, but going d5, somehow this bishop, sorry for the diagonal here, this bishop becomes a major force. So it's not like we do h3 only to stop this. No, on the contrary, we want to have our bishop there and stopping d5 in a way. So we're not only stopping h4, h3, we are kind of stopping d5. You could argue, why not go knight fd7 again and put the knight on c5? But here, it seems like you can put the bishop to d1 and you will sort of pause it on c2. And, well, on c2, you can argue it's a bad bishop because, well, both its diagonals are blocked. But I would argue that on c2, it's a kind of well-placed bishop in terms of it is useful, but at the same time defending the weak pawns like this. So somehow you manage to, well, you release your rooks from the duties of defending the b3 pawn. You can perhaps put them in the e and the d file. And with a bishop on h2 and a bishop on c2, maybe at some point you can even push f4. And this seems to be quite promising for white. So h3 is a cool move. And if h4, well, you're backing with the bishop to h2, and you will start insinuating playing f4 at some point. And like this, you actually start underlining that perhaps h5 was a little bit too early. But, well, in the game, it went sort of also well, as we saw. White played too stereotypically. He played the move bishop to f1. That's basically how you were told you were supposed to do. And after h4, he went queen f2, attacking this pawn, and now we saw rook c5 happening, and we get, after bishop e3, to our game. Okay, the computer says that, well, you could also play d5 here, but I guess it's a detail that doesn't really matter. And, well, let's end it where we started here, that, well, d5, it's such a powerful theme. I mean, we saw it unleashes the potential energy of basically, I would not say basically, literally all the black pieces. I mean, well, we saw different scenarios of how black managed to sort of breach the white defenses, and actually all the pieces seem to take part of this attack. So I think a very cool example by the author, and it really shows black's overwhelming sort of potential energy in the hedgehog structure. But also, I think when we went into some details later, we saw how white could combat it. So it's a good double-edged example, I think. Our next example is a very typical plan for black when white somehow, I wouldn't say loses the thread, but more starts becoming a little bit passive. Well, part of black's hedgehog structure is that it's not so easy for white to break through. And when white sort of comes to a halt, black's sort of dilemma is that should they just stay completely passive or should they try some kind of counterplay? But, well, we can see the last move is putting the rook on g8. And this is quite a popular plan of playing the move g5. It's famous from a game between Fischer and Anderson. Well, Fischer having the white pieces, but with the sort of structure reversed. And we saw it later also in a game, I think, between Carlsen and Abdusattorov, both actually coming from 1b3, which sometimes leads to hedgehog structures. I was commenting this Carlsen game quite in depth for New and Chess magazine, and I noticed that while Carlsen was extremely successful with the plan, and so was Fischer, the computer was not a huge fan of it, and it's actually quite the same here. There's nothing wrong with going Rook G8 here, but after the move Queen A2, which again gives this sort of flimsy impression of what is white exactly doing, the author is really praising the move G5 here. And this is also sort of the general consensus that, well, when white gets passive, black starts pounding like this, and it's aiming at the weak white king again. It is not sort of per se a bad plan, but we should understand that it also weakens the black structure. It's actually quite logical, right? We will follow up with Rook G6 perhaps and bring the rook here, and then things will start flowing. But it doesn't seem to be as strong as we think. I think perhaps the reason for black being so successful with this plan, or with colors reversed to white, is that I mentioned, well, it was Carlsen who played it, it was Fischer who played it, right? They were the stronger players in this game. And it's more, I guess, the situation is that white starts stalling, doesn't know what to do, and then black breaks through like this. But from the start of my sentence, it somehow gives away that quite typically it is the stronger player who gets to execute this plan, and it's more like it's a possible plan rather than it's an extremely strong one. And it's an attractive one also. It feels cool to play like this, right? You hide your king in the corner and then you start attacking anyway. It's not so usual. So, of course, I mean, I can really get the sort of attraction. So after G5, Twan Berg plays the move H3, which is incredibly logical. It's to stop the G4 advance. Of course, there is the problem that when G4 happens, more things will be exchanged, leading to that the king will be more open. And the computer actually thinks H3 is not a great move here. It suggests going instead in this position the move Queen to D2. And quite puzzling for me, it actually says white has quite some advantage here. Perhaps not a huge advantage, but definitely an advantage. What's relevant to understand is that after G4, it looks like, well, black is basically forcing an opening of the G file. But it's not the case. We can play the move F4. Then, well, the visual idea is that, isn't this pawn just hanging? And for sure it is. But a position like this, the computer says that, sure, you know, you won a pawn, but that's not what matters anymore. I'm going to reroute my knight to G3, my bishop is going to go to D4, and your king is actually quite exposed here. And if you start, let's say, exchanging, let's say something like these bishops, well, your pawn on D6 is going to be weak. The computer says white has a considerable advantage in this position, which is, to call it shocking is a bit much. I mean, with modern computers, we're used to more or less anything, right? But this is an important thing to grasp, that white is actually much better here. And this made it quite interesting for me, that here, what should you actually do? The computer suggests maybe flick in the move G3, but white can still play H3. And suddenly, with this structure, right, the king is going to be quite safe on H1, because this pawn on G3 actually somehow blocks in a way. So after the move Queen D2, the computer thinks that H6 is actually better. You should sort of, you protect the pawn on G5, and you can perhaps improve your position with King H7, Rook to G6, and you have a complicated middle game position, which the computer says is slightly better for white, but that it does in the hedgehogs anyway. So this is not sort of a deal breaker in any way, but that you actually have to pause and play H6 and say that My attack in a direct sense is not gonna, happen, but I will improve my position slightly, and then perhaps I will do it later. Seems to be the right thing. But this, g4, f4 is a very, very strong concept. And, this image of white just being a pure pawn down, but instead, this, what was supposed to be an attack, has actually considerably weakened the black king and left him in a very vulnerable state. I thought was very interesting. Anyway, our game went h3, and now after h5, suddenly, as I mentioned earlier, g4 starts coming with much more force. It's a little bit funny, actually, that, the game does go queen d2. So basically, what we just spoke of, but with this sort of interpolation having happened, which is quite favorable for black. The game was g4, and now I think the author suggests maybe you should even play the move h4, but that generally just sort of is a huge admittance of that, we shouldn't have touched this side at all. So the game was takes, and now even here, it would be much better to play the move f4. Again, if you start taking on e4, we're going to have great compensation like this because of the sort of exposed king. And in this position, after f4, the computer says, the correct move is actually rook g7. It sort of combines providing perhaps a bit of cover, so there is like that, and the rook can perhaps go here. Maybe we can even start bringing material to the king side like this. Of course, the open h file is gonna favor black, and that's exactly the point of putting the rook on g7, that we're gonna use this open file. But even so, f4 was a crucial move here. This game is from 2011. Twan Burke does it quite like, you were supposed to do at that time, but it's very insufficient here. I think this pawn sacrifice, as we mentioned, is too advanced for 2011 understanding. So bishop g5 happens, takes, and now just rook g6. And, the game was something like this, and black has a huge attack. I think we can stop it here. I mean, it's, I think, maybe perhaps queen h4 and then king g7. The king is very cozy here, and black can attack both in the g file and the h file, and is much better and soon won. But I thought it's a very interesting example, and in general, it's important to sort of at least poke to the understanding that this plan of rook g8 and g5, it should not be overestimated. It should be understood. It's there. I mean, we have seen Fischer, we have seen Carlsen do it. It's very much part of the, vocabulary of the Hedgehog. It's a quite decent plan. But all the examples tend to end incredibly well for the one doing it. And that could be due to the players rather than the actual objective merits. And now remember, it was quite a revelation for me to study the Carlsen game and comment on it, and the same feeling I get here, that that you will just play f4, you will happily abandon the e4 pawn, and that something like this is actually much better for white. I had no idea of before sort of reading this book and studying it for this course with the computer. So I think, it is a key concept of the Hedgehog, but we really have to understand the double-edged nature. It's not like you should never play for g5. You should, but you should do it when it's good. And that's pretty good general advice, right? So play only moves when they're good. We're gonna end on this high note, this example. Our next game is between Galkin and Delchev from the European Championship in 2001 in Ohrid, Macedonia. I remember the event quite well. I was playing there, not particularly successfully. I think I lost like 20 ELO points, but more for some dramatic things. I think there was some kind of civil war situation happening at the time, and I remember the bus going from the airport to the playing hall. Suddenly was stopped, and I was wondering why, and there was a tank next to us. And during the event, the the sort of the airport was closed down for more than 1 week, but it reopened when we had to leave again. So it was, well, you can say quite dramatic for the players, but actually for us it didn't have any particular effect. But of course, very dramatic for the local citizens and the country. Anyway, back to chess and the hedgehog, right? It looks like a fairly standard position. Perhaps this knight on a3 looks misplaced to you, and it kind of is, but it ended up there to force this kind of hedgehog structure. It sometimes, well, we see these things that pieces will look misplaced, and you will think, why on earth did they put them there? But they put them there to force this structure, and now they should try and perhaps sort of reroute them to a more normal square. Again, we have this bishop on c7. And this is a very typical idea of putting it there. I've mentioned some skepticism towards it in an earlier example because the computer is not a huge fan of it. Well, the idea of playing the move bishop c7 is, of course, to, well, put some kind of pressure like this. And Galkin reacts with the move queen g1, which also is extremely typical. Basically, it was sort of seen as the advanced way of playing. It was that Black makes this battery, but then white can do like this and protect the pawn on h2. Well, sometimes these kind of conventions happens, and we don't really check fully enough. Is that really necessary? In this position, queen g1 is, well, you can argue it's a lazy move. It's a very human move because, well, you don't want to check all the time. Can black actually go d5 and expose this pawn on h2? But you really should, although it sounds a bit stressful. Because, well, you could just go knight c2 here. And, well, if d5, well, we take a couple of times like this. And when you take on h2, well, it's very simple. You can play f4, and this bishop is just lost on h2. You are sort of managed to communicate this pair of pieces, and white just wins. Of course, you can argue that, well, queen g1, is it so bad? I think not in general. I mean, time is not typically a huge issue in these hedgehog structures, but it is kind of clumsy. And well, when we know what's coming, that he's gonna go king h8, rook g8, the queen starts feeling exposed on the g1 square. So what should we do instead? Well, I mentioned knight to c2. And I thought, let's ask the computer. If I go king h8, what happens? Sure, it puts the knight on d4 and goes rook g8, then what? It says that most moves are pretty nice for white, but it's very noteworthy that its favorite move is g4. Well, I love it, of course. I love strange things. It's sort of very paradoxical, right? That it's black who is trying to push for g5, and we counter it by going g4 ourselves and threatening g5. It's a very cool way of playing chess, a very modern one. I'm not sure I've seen any examples like this, and perhaps, I mean, we would even put our king on g1 to get out of this diagonal, or who knows, maybe we will start attacking on the king's side. It's very interesting, and, well, the computer says almost like +1 here. So g4, I don't know what the particular relevance is, but I thought I would flick in this example because it's quite useful. And we see that, well, in the game, he chooses passivity. He goes queen g1. And, I mean, I guess what I like about this example is that that's how we were all taught to do it, as I mentioned. But it seems to that quite some of our sort of thoughts or our understanding was too stereotypical in a way. So queen g1 happens, and now black goes king h8. Well, Galkin decides to try and double in the d file, goes rook c2, and now the move rook g8, the doubling happens, and the move g5. And while I said before that, well, this g5 plan, in the previous example, the computer is not always a huge fan of, at this extent, it actually is. It thinks that, no, black is doing completely fine here. And I think the next steps are quite instructive. After queen f2, well, the idea is not to go g4 immediately. I guess that, well, moves like f4 could be a nuisance, right? It just goes he just goes rook g6 and starts preparing things. It's like, well, what is white gonna do? And our sort of hedgehog structure is very good at absorbing white attempts. Of course, we have seen that it can be broken down, but it will not be broken down immediately. And basically, well, we seem to be in time to switch attention to the king's side. But of course, it's happening because white is yo-yoing back and forth like this, that he has a knight on a3 that is somewhat exposed, not exposed, but decentralized. So white is not in time to do something very useful. He tries to reroute his knight, and after knight c2, rook c2, g8, he does the same mistake as we saw in the previous example. Well, the reasoning, if you would just sort of use verbal sort of means, is very logical. Black threatens g4, and because of that, we play the move h3. It's very easy to construct this sentence. It sounds logical, right? But the problem is that I think the correct sentence is that, well, we can't prevent g4. So does it help or hurt having included this sort of h3, h5 thing? And most likely it hurts, because g4 will happen anyway, and then the h3 is going to be a further target. So it would be better to have kept the pawn on h2 to provide a little bit more cover for the king. But, well, luckily he didn't, and we get this beautiful example. So bishop d4 happens, and now another nice move, rook to g7. It can look hopefully weird. Why are we doubling like this? But it's very flexible in terms of, well, we can actually choose, maybe we jump to the h file. There is also this perhaps potential escape square on g8, sort of getting out of harm's way. Not that there is that much harm from this bishop at the moment, but who knows, it could be kind of useful. And he goes b4, at least starting to insinuate that, hang on, I need to have some kind of counterplay. But Delchev does a final cool move. He plays queen g8. So actually, I mean, he's tripled in the g file. Tripling behind sort of a closed file is somewhat unusual. But it just gives you this idea that we want to go g4, and we want to do it with tremendous force. And we also want to be ready to have, well, we can actually triple in the h file. Not, we cannot triple, but we can put a queen and a rook, depending on our choice, in the h file with quite some effect. The game was king g1, then g4, and I think it was something like takes. If h4, then apparently g3, queen f3, e5, and when the bishop goes back, then we go rook h7, and basically, well, we're going to pick up this pawn, and then the king is just going to be way too exposed. Of course, bishop g5, we would be extremely happy to sacrifice and exchange. Okay, we could take back on g5, but this is made in a few moves. Well, I can just show it. It's always nice to give mate, right, like this. So here, I mean, like in the previous game, it ended up with well, not taking on g4, but sort of blocking out the bishop with the move e5. And after bishop e3 takes here, I think we will end it here. It's like in the previous game. The g file has become a humongous force. Black's sort of white's king is very exposed, and well, black is just completely winning and won quite easily from here. Of course, it scares me a bit that I'm advertising so much to play this g5 plan, or I'm trying not to oversell it. I'm actually trying to be extremely cautious. But, well, as I mentioned in the previous example, modern computers are somewhat skeptical, and I think it's cool to debate the pros and cons. And of course, also, I really wanted to flig in this idea of, well, this tactic that the bishop can be stuck on h2 is important. And, well, queen g1 then becomes a lazy move because you actually spent energy defending against something you shouldn't. And then I think, well, I really like this move g4 to mention this. It's interesting that you have to play like this. I was about to say no one has really done it. Well, I did it at some point to Rasovayev. Unfortunately, I had also pawns on b4 and a4, and maybe even on h4. And it went completely wrong. And I think Rasovayev afterwards told me in the game, after the game, there is some kind of saying that, you know, if you put 4 pawns on the 4th rank as a white in the headshots, it's okay. But if you do 5, it's too much. And he told me, well, you did 6, and he completely undermined my position. But apparently Sometimes it's okay, but well, we're only talking about 3 pawns now. But it's interesting that moves like g4 exists. So I hope that this counterbalances this sort of general impression that g5 is just a very strong plan for black. Sometimes it is, and I think this example also shows that it can be very effective, but I hope I managed to balance it so you will have a nuanced opinion of this concept. Our next game shows a quite typical, and I would almost say essential plan in this Hedgehog structure, which we kind of ignored till now. It's very logical. I mean, white has a center like this, and this gives him obviously some space advantages. From black's perspective, undermining with b5 would be quite ideal. That would, well, it would give black more space and it would minimize the white space advantage. The reason we haven't seen it till now is that it's quite typically hard to realize, because white very often has a great control of the b5 square. And he does now, so you cannot really do it immediately. The move by Zuniga is not unheard of, but still quite atypical. He plays the move rook to a7. He wants to, well, get the bishop back to a8 and the rook to c7 to create some kind of harmony. But the queen on b8 was a little bit in the way of that. So somehow he's doing it like this. It's a quite reasonable move, perhaps not the best, not the worst. But I think it's also quite typical of why is the Hedgehog such a somewhat popular structure, especially by stronger players needing to win the game. It's because of the unbalanced character. It's very asymmetrical, and black can, well, hope to win in the long term. It also puts a considerable amount of burden on white, because, well, white has a beautiful position, but what to do next? Well, in this game, he starts taking some space. It's quite reasonable. He goes f4, bishop drops back, a3, rook to c8, b4. So white has improved his position by getting some space. He's also weakened it a little bit, you can argue. But, I mean, well, I mentioned these pawns before. Now they're actually somewhat weaker, but at first glance, that shouldn't really matter. White keeps centralizing, and so does black to some extent. Now, of course, comes the question of what to do next with black. I mean, well, we want to win, so we can't just sit and wait. Zuniga plays a very, the author calls it a daring idea, and I think that's the right description. Zuniga is the higher rated player in these games, and he probably knows what he's doing. I mean, he got his high rating by, you know, being very strong practically, and I think he has a good grasp of what he can allow himself to do and what not. He plays the move knight to a7. Now we can see that he's really getting ready for this b5 push, and he wants to sort of undermine the c4 pawn, and with that, the white sort of control of the center. Well, to call it a bluff is a little bit too much. It is actually a strong plan, but the problem is that, well, white could also play a strong plan as his own, and then it becomes a clash of strong plans where white would be the one prevailing. f5 would be a very strong move, but that takes some courage from white, because, well, it would really mean that this square is becoming weakened, and this knight would be beautiful on e5. The problem is that in this position, well, for instance, white could take an e6, and, well, the author says that the computer actually thinks b5 is a great move, but he says even sacrificing an exchange like this would lead to a very promising position for white. Now suddenly this knight is unstable, and this bishop is going to open up like this. So I think the computer says that, well, maybe you could go on with b5, which would perhaps be Zuniga's plan. But then I noticed the computer suggesting that, well, if you take an e6 and go c5, your position is winning. I was a bit puzzled. Is it that good? And it says yes, because the idea is to go knight g4. And basically the plan is to just play something like queen g5, where knight h6 starts becoming a devastating threat. And suddenly, I think this sort of bunch of pieces over here is quite far away from the king. And it's very logical. I mean, well, if you take on b4, we're just going to take back, the computer was saying. And this position is, it's possible to understand that the white attack is kind of overwhelming here. But, well, this is the kind of risk that Soniga seems to be willing to run. And this means that now and then you end up losing, but on the road to that, you're going to win a lot of games like this one. So his opponent, he didn't dare pushing f5. He was probably afraid of weakening the e5 square, right? So he played a more cautious move. He thinks, oh, my opponent is about to undermine with b5. Why don't I go rook c1 and starts defending against this? But this very much plays into black's hand. So black played b5. The game was takes, and now suddenly, well, we are starting to exchange pieces, but we have managed to sort of undermine his space advantage. And I would say that, sure, of course, you can argue that white do have more space, but we would think that it's more like the pawn on e4 is kind of a weakness, and by removing the c4 pawn, we have opened the c file. And while exchanges do happen now, as we will see, it's not that comfortable for white at all, because now knight f6 happens, and it immediately starts putting pressure on this weak pawn, right? And after queen c2, we start undermining with a5. This is really an ideal, you can say, hedgehog, or you could say Sicilian kind of counterplay. It's very typical in the sense that, well, the white space advantage has turned into weaknesses. This is exactly what black is hoping for. Black is not hoping for this immediate counterattack, but he's hoping for having the long-term trumps, and that's really has sort of happened now. The game was queen c4. It's not impossible to just exchange like this and win a pawn, even though that, of course, well, there will be some counterplay like this. As I mentioned, Soniga is very practical, so he played queen b6 instead. And after b5, he had this nice trick taking like this and going the move d5. And he wins back sort of the pawn and will have the pair of bishops and manage to win. I think there is just one nice trick to show that in this position, there is queen e6. And, well, basically it wins a piece because the d5 bishop is attacked. You obviously, it's illegal to take on e6 because of the king hanging on h1. And you can't do like this because the queen is hanging. So basically this sort of cross pins wins the game. I think, well, it's enough to show till here. Black is just much better now. I don't know what to fully take away from this game. I mean, sure, it's nice to see a plan like rook a7 and regrouping like this. And it's nice to see that you can sort of start undermining with b5. But as we saw, well, the circumstances have to be right, which are not particularly here. You could play a move like f5. And I think even, let's say, in this position, the computer says that knight d5 is a strong move. And if you take like this, we're going to take back with this pawn, and the knight is going to jump to f5 with actually quite an edge for white. So I'm not telling you just play like Soniga thinks it's going to be fine. I'm trying to show some kind of potential that is in black's position, but unless you are as daring as Soniga, perhaps you need to do it under slightly more favorable circumstances. Our final example is a funny one. It's Bartholomew against Gareev from 2009. Well, it's a good example, but there is some kind of humor in it. So let's get to that. Basically, if you want to play the hedgehog successfully, it requires patience because, well, I mean, it's not like you can do something immediately, right? You're dreaming of breaks like d5 or b5 perhaps, but white is doing his best to prevent that. So sometimes you just have to be very calm. Actually, well, here you could play the move h5. The computer actually says this perhaps is the best move. Sometimes it's not, but here I guess perhaps knight g6 and h4 is kind of supporting it well enough to be able to do it immediately. But that's very much not the theme of our game. That's just some kind of extra. Gareev chooses to play the move bishop to f8. We can argue a bit, why is Gareev able to be so patient? He's a very special person, and I think he is even famous for. So at some point, he played two tournaments at the same time, and I mean literally the same time. They were, I think, the story is that he traveled from one venue to the other, actually during play, to be able to play both. I've forgotten the details, and it's really not an example to follow. So let's sort of leave it at that. But his patience could be explained from other means, one could argue. Anyway, no, that was a weird detour. So the game just really nothing happens, which is kind of the point. So white plays bishop f1. He starts shuffling. Well, slightly. For the moment, they still do improve their positions. Knight a4, sort of eyeing the pawn on b6. But he plays the move queen to c6, and well, that's a nice little tactic. Should you take on b6, then there is this nice move, knight to g4, and after this thing, well, we can see the tactic ending up like this, winning the piece back on b6, and now, of course, black is structurally much better with equal material. So white goes back with knight c3, but no particularly harm done. I mentioned this knight being misplaced on a3, and it is to quite an extent. But it does cover the b5 square, which means that this b5 advance is not really happening. And getting d5 in is also quite difficult. Well, I mean, do it like this, we see that it immediately opens fire against the black queen. So he plays the move bishop to e7. Well, it just came from f8. Why does it go back to e7? Well, now he wants to insinuate that he wants to play the move g5. But he changes his mind, or perhaps he didn't change his mind, he's just a little bit bluffing. So he's going back and forth like this. He might take some space with b4, and he thinks, now you have weakened your c4 pawn a little bit. So he goes not for g5, but he just goes back with the rook like this. And, well, a threat to the b6 pawn, a regrouping like this, bishop back to e3, queen to b7, and they generally start moving a little bit back and forth like this. And this is quite typical of black, I would say, maybe also even of white, that there can become this kind of, it's not stalemate, but there is a limit to what you can do. It's easier to suppress the counterplay. I have seen examples where they just make a draw, and that's quite reasonable. But here, well, white feels provoked, and he does the move b5. His argument, I guess, is that if you take like this, well, then you get the a4 square, and you can actually start attacking the weak pawn on b6. Well, Garev actually has sort of understood that. So he plays the nice move rook to c7. And now, let's say if you go knight c3, well, we can start playing the move a5. And you are sort of stuck with the pawn on a4 like this. And, well, it's not like, well, it's easy for black to do something. But maybe now you can start playing for this on g5, says the author. And somehow the queen side has been fixed favorably from black's perspective. So in the game, he took on a6, and now knight c5 happened, queen c2, rook a7. And black managed to take back on a6. It's sort of positionally better now with these weak pawns, and went on to win a game. Why did the author include this? I think, like me, he probably thinks it's a little bit funny. But I think also it is relevant to sort of, show a position like this, because if you're guessing how many moves has black played at this point, you could say 17 moves, but this is actually 29 moves. This kind of going back and forth is part of playing the hedgehog. And we have seen many examples where black starts pushing h5, he starts pushing g5. And this is quite legitimate. But it's also important to understand this core solidity there is, and that black can actually sometimes just go back and forth. What has white been doing? Well, putting pawns like this, you can say it puts some kind of aggression towards the black position, but you can also argue its weaknesses. The same with these knights. Are they good or are they bad? They are not in very optimal squares. If we actually remember back to our first example, the Kasparov-Kramnik thing, the white pieces were positioned much more, I would say, dynamically, with basically all the pieces being useful. There it was the knights in the D file and rooks in C and B file, right, if you remember. So I think a kind of funny last example, but probably it should be seen not mainly as a joke. It's actually important, this idea that you can stall with black and you can just live on your core solidity. But, well, then white does something and he gets punished. And I think maybe that's also part of it, right? I mean, Gareev might has been sort of giving a very sort of uninterested sort of attitude by going back and forth. And then suddenly, well, you wake up when action happens, and this is part of the thing in the headshot. So, again, well, a slight joke to finish off this chapter, but I hope that at least created a smile on your face.